Start. Hello, Internet. Sorry for being 5 minutes late. Welcome to a retro episode of Studio Remote, brought to you by Columbia University Libraries. It's a retro episode because, as you can see from my name here along the bottom, we're using the old template, the template that we used for the first version of the show here for Studio Remote, the Rose Hall project. And the reason we're talking about, or the reason I'm using that imagery is because we are using an old school, the old school return to talking about. Sorry, I have myself on echo here. Okay, there we go. Things are a little bit busy today, but luckily, it's worth it because the Unsilencing Slavery, the website that we have been working on for many years to put online, is currently online at unsilencing-slavery.org. And not only is the website live, more or less in celebration of the 60th anniversary of Jamaica's independence and the Emancipendence celebration more broadly, but we have unusually for this Tuesday stream, two guests. So I'm going to just stop talking and move straight over to having them here with me. And wait, Alex, let me. Shit. Sorry, and I shouldn't have sworn, but now it's too late. Okay, now please introduce yourselves. Now everything is going to run smoothly. It was just that one little transition that was a bit of a mess, and now please speak.
Hi, I'm Alex Gil.
Well,
I
I can't hear
am.
you, but the internet can hear you.
I can still hear you.
Okay, and now I can hear you, and the internet can hear you, and everything is going well, except that now it says Alex. There we go. Now please speak, Alex.
Alex Gil.
Yes.
Uh, I am senior lecturer and associate research faculty of digital humanities in the Spanish and Portuguese department at Yale, and a part of the Rose Hall project team for the past 2 years and a half or 3 years. Time is a blur at this particular point. And I pass the mic to our colleague Celia Naylor.
Hi, thanks, Alex and Moacir. I'm Celia Naylor. I'm a professor in history and Africana studies at Barnard College, and I am one of the collaborators on this website. That has, yeah, it's been many years in coming, and it finally is here. And as Alex noted in his reflections, that I also see this as a beginning rather than an end for many other people to be involved in this sort of work. So happy to be here with my other collaborators, and Monique is joining, our one other collaborator in this. And just really grateful to be here and excited, really excited that it's finally live. So thanks to you all. Monique, we're just introducing ourselves. So if you want to do that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm.
Okay, awesome.
Go ahead. Sorry, Monique.
Oh, are you sure?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, just getting my video on. Hey everyone. I came in the nick of time, I guess. I'm Monique Williams. I have been working with Professor Neil from 2017, around the inception of the book proposal for the this Rose Hall project on silencing slavery. So I was working with Professor from the archives to the book manuscript, and then now to the website with this wonderful team. I've been mainly focused on content and just basically supporting Professor Naylor in sorting through a lot of documents, a lot of details, and just trying to craft stories about enslaved persons at Rose Hall that really do their lives and the history justice.
Super. I guess maybe I'm sort of driving the show here, so I can take us all to the other screen that will have the website in place. Or do you want to talk about the website first, or talk a bit about the book and the project, etc.? Celia, what do you feel like doing?
I would love to start with the website. I
Oh,
think we can start there and then I can talk a little bit about the book, but really I'd love to start with the website. That'd be
okay,
great.
great. So I'm going to switch over here to the website view that, oh, you all can see on Zoom what is going through on YouTube, right? Like you see my computer screen now? Or do you see my face?
Your face.
Oh, it's
Yep.
because I haven't started the video. There we go. Now you see the screen. So now in when you see my little window, you'll see what you see, which includes yourselves, so you can see how you look. So I, as the host, I'm still a slightly bigger picture, but all four of us are here for now. So I can now go and back to. So on my computer, let's open up the website and go to the URL. I already mentioned it once, but again, it's unsilencing-slavery.org. And this is going to be a very, very challenging look through the website because I'm going to try to not make changes to the website while we're going through it. Or actually, let me not stretch it past our faces. Okay, so Celia, why do you want us to start with the website?
So it's been interesting thinking about, especially as it's now fully live, thinking about the website in relation to the book. And if I could do it all over again, 15/15 hindsight, I would actually have finished working with you all on the website and then finish the book. There are ways that the website, I think, provides so many other additional stories and insights. And that's not to say that some of those aren't in the book as well. It's just that with the book, there's more of a thematic and sort of a general presentation of Rose Hall and the enslaved people who were there. And with the website, we were really able to focus on individuals, and there was more specificity in terms of those individuals. If I had tried to do that with the book, it would have been really difficult for people to follow. And so it really works so well. And in some ways, I won't say this to the press, but in some ways, the website actually resonates with me more because of those individual profiles that we were able to create. And I think you get some sense of that with the book, but not the full sense of that you get with the website. So that's why I wanted to start with the website.
Could this be a sort of genre distinction that there's your the book comes out of a genre of academic scholarly historical publishing, even though it's very personally driven. You have personal anecdotes of going to Rose Hall, etc., that you use to mobilize the argument that you're making, whereas this website, even though it's an academic website in the sense that it was built within the confines or the structures of the way that librarians work with researchers to create websites and then publish them and put them online. It maybe has a different audience in mind. So a generic question and a question of audience, is that maybe part of what informs your response to how you respond to them differently?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, Moacir, it's there are different audiences that I had in mind, and not separate and distinct, but overlapping audiences. And with every form that we utilize, whatever format, platform, there are going to be lots of different opportunities and also related challenges. And so with the book, there were some parameters, though some might say that I pushed many of those parameters in terms of it being an interdisciplinary work, right? Because I was trying to pull the different pieces together, the actual archival material as well as the novel that drives the tours that currently happen. And so I wanted all of those pieces in one space in the book. And at the same time, with the website and some of the scholarly work that's been done, right, in terms of Jamaica and on slavery. And with the website, I really just wanted for us to focus on the people themselves and not have to provide as much of the background information, as much of an overview that people might expect. And even there, I didn't actually go into a lot of details about, I mean, I put a lot of that into the footnotes, into the endnotes, which is why the endnotes are so long, so that there would still be a narrative and people wouldn't be so distracted by the endnotes, which are a staple, right, of a history text or really any scholarly text, or most scholarly texts, I should say. So I think, yes, absolutely, genre, purpose, audiences, interdisciplinarity, all of that is absolutely in the mix, Moacir, absolutely.
I think that Alex, you looked like you were about to say something.
No, I was struck today going over after the result of all of this work. I was struck by how each of these narratives, well, not all of them, but like most of them, I would say, actually show that there had to be a methodological verification process where one name, you go then through every register to see if that one name is there, and then you find different little bits of information in each one of the just simple fact of having to like do this exhaustively for every person. It's an act of like care about every person that I can see how the book, like because the book you're always you're going after the nuggets of information that would link to the narrative constrained by the genre that you're working with. But this type of website forces you into an exhaustiveness that is not necessarily like you get what you need when you're making this point or this point or this point. But this kind of exhaustiveness actually asks you to care about every single person in those registers and try to follow their footsteps each one by one. So I kind of like I agree with you, Celia. I'm like I'm glad you said what you said, because this is something I was noticing that this website does in a way that I have never seen in a history book. You know, like.
Yeah, I think. Monica, did you want to add something before I plow ahead with my rumination?
I was just going to completely just add to that, saying that, you know, when making the individual profiles or continuing on with the profiles Professor had started, you know, when you look in the book, as Professor said, there's a larger thematic narrative at hand, and not necessarily every single person or enslaved person gets the same amount of real estate, right? You could say. Whereas in the website, it was a very painstaking process to ensure that any detail that we had, right, factually about said person was included as far as it was relevant and, you know, reflective of what we've done with everyone else. So even myself going back into the profiles after doing the archival stuff, even reading through the book, it was much more of a thorough process, very painstaking, and definitely, you know, motivated by a personal passion and drive to ensure that every person got their kind of moment in the spotlight, as you know, to say the least.
I think that I wanted to go back to this idea of the Rose Hallness of this project, because one can definitely, and I think that this is, I never thought of it in these terms, but this seems to be coming out of what we're talking about now, which is that there's a way of doing this where the website would have like pictures of Rose Hall, that would maybe have like a map that would sort of exist in some kind of using a kind of rhetoric, or again speaking in terms of genre, using a kind of genre of like the tourist website, or that it would be somehow a website about Rose Hall qua Rose Hall, and that somehow the people documented here and the people whose stories are being retold, it seems not quite the right word, because the telling and the reness on both sides doesn't quite work, because it's hard to imagine how these stories had been told beforehand to then also be retold, and then also to imagine that if they had been told beforehand, how this stands in as a, like, the kind of the possibility of this being a retelling of those previous stories, because the information here is not based on the stories that these people told themselves, like in the evening around a dinner table or something, where they're remembering their own familiar relationships, etc. These are tellings that are based out of this external structure of control and power, that is to say, the registries and ledgers of these enslaved people. And I think that's kind of important to me, because when we were working on this the whole time, we were always calling this the Rose Hall Project, and the Columbia URL, which currently doesn't work, or has a placeholder for it. Like, the Columbia URL even has Rose Hall in it. And when we made the last minute decision to sort of try to make this available more quickly, no effort was made to have the words Rose Hall in the URL. And Rose Hall is in the subheading of the title of the website. And I know that in earlier design versions there was the idea of maybe having a picture of one of the buildings from the plantation, like in the background or something. And that, to me, that always felt kind of wrong, because this is challenging the idea of, or not challenging, refusing the idea of talking about this space in the context of it being a concrete plantation that is then remobilized for tourist purposes. I don't know that this website would encourage something resembling tourism to Rose Hall. And if it did, it definitely wouldn't be people eager to play golf on the White Witch golf course, or whatever it's called. And so I never really thought of it in those terms, because, again, just this whole time we've been talking about it as the Rose Hall Project, etc. But then ultimately it's not about that. It is 100% about this group of people that contingently, that accidentally, that through the logics of the slavocracy happen to be collected at a place that we refer to as Rose Hall. But it's not the place that's important, it's the people that are important. Right?
Absolutely. And, it was a very purposeful decision not to have it included, right? I mean, you can find, if you look up Rose Hall, you can, quickly come to those images of the house as it stands now, with a couple of historical images too, of the house. And it was important, for the book and for the website, not to necessarily center it, Rose Hall. So as you can see here, it's the Rose Hall the Rose Hall Great House is right in the center. It's at a distance, because this is a shot from the perspective, of the road leading into it. And so this image appears both in the book and on the website. The book's cover, actually, one of the things that I wanted the designer to do was to not center all the images that we had of the house itself, of the Great House. And so on the cover of the book, behind On Silencing Slavery, the title is actually an image of the book. I mean, of the house. You can, as you zoom in, you can see the windows, but it is blacked out. And so for me, it was about, again, moving the house from the center in many ways to the margins, and then the individual people, right, from the margins to the center, not only of the archival documents, but also of the stories that are told at this plantation today, right, at that tourist site. It's interesting, Moacir, you mentioned like thinking about these profiles and knowing that we don't arrive at these profiles because we're sitting in on a couple or several of these people talking about their experiences. And we have some sense of that when we look at something like the WPA interviews that were conducted in the United States in the 1930s into the 1940s of previously enslaved people in the United States, right? We don't have that for Jamaica. And so if these individuals actually were able to tell their stories and to reflect on their individual lives and their collective lives, they would probably have highlighted many other meaningful things that don't appear in the book or on the website. So what we're trying to do here is to think about what we have, right? The pieces of information that we have to pull together, right? These individual profiles. And at the same time, recognize that these are not full or complete in any way. They're simply pieces pulled together as a way to reflect some sense of the humanity of these enslaved persons, right? So I like the idea, and I hope that as people read through these, that to the extent that they're able and willing, that they don't necessarily see them as definitive profiles, right? But simply just a nugget of a much fuller and robust life and lives of these individuals. So anyway, I just wanted to say that as well.
Yeah, I want to keep on with the theme. I want to connect the Moacir's idea that what this is doing is not how business is done as usual. With the last thing you said in terms of of the context of data representations of Black life in the Atlantic world from the 16th until the 19th century, of which we see many more new examples. Now, of course, this tradition we can probably say dates back to Du Bois's own contributions to data visualization in social sciences in the 100 years ago, 100 and change years ago. But now we see a boom because of the way that these visualizations are becoming interactive. They're being done online, and they're being done with new data sets, larger data sets, etc. And one of the things that is happening right now, for example, and there's a sort of kind of like gold rush to do this because of the profitability of genealogy sites and TV shows, like the one that Skip Gates runs, is that the idea of reconstructing lives is being understood as a profitable thing, but one that can be done through scientific and data scientific methods. So either combination of DNA analysis or in data terms, by using algorithms, using a technology called open link data that will connect all the data sets of data. This is actually something that's happening with Matrix and the Voyages people, and they have a series of big grants to do this, where they want to be able to connect all the data sets in like South Carolina to like Mississippi, to like with all the data they have from the Voyages and all these things, in one big central clearinghouse where you can type then a name of somebody, and then algorithmically the machine will try to recreate what we did by hand. And we'll try to tell you this person, this marriage certificate that is in the Library of South Carolina is probably connects to the death certificate of this person in New York City. So therefore this person must have migrated and this kind of thing. I personally think that is a very risky proposition, creating a lot of false positives, and actually creating, I think it describes even a little bit the dehumanization of these things. If all of these are pieces that a machine can then just reconstruct together without the embodiment of like passing through a subject of a descendant, like you guys, Monique and Celia. These little nuggets had to pass through you, not a machine. So yes, they're fragmented in little things, but there's a lot of meaning in the fact that those fragments actually came through you rather than a mechanical process. which is the way that it's being done en masse. So that all of these past lives eventually will, nothing can stop that machine, I don't think, right now. I mean, we can critique it, and we will critique it and continue to critique it. But that machine is well in motion. And there, a lot of Black lives from that period are going to be reconstructed that way. But this, we propose something new, and something that I think carries with it a different ethics and a different possibility for the reconstruction of Black lives. The hunger is there, I get it, but I think the means don't justify the end sometimes of how we're gonna end up here. And I think our means actually provide a different path. So I would say this is also very different in that sense, Moacir, to business as usual as it's being done right now.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned in my reflection, there was a time when we had machine-generated profiles of the people, and that seemed like an okay solution, and I can justify it one way that I think is important, because in the machineness, it, like, there's no uncanny valley. Like it doesn't feel like maybe this is actually a biography. It feels like it sort of it very much reveals the fact that it's trying to take information from a data table and turn it into human readable language. So it's like the opposite of when in algebra class you got a word problem where you said, like, if two cars leave and at the same time and go different speeds, etc., and what you had to do is you had to take this human language and convert it into algebra in order to solve which car got where first. This is sort of the same thing in reverse, where the old profiles, because they were so generic and machine driven, one way of thinking about them is as dehumanizing, or another way is that they reinforce, they re-amplify the inability to talk about, or the problems put forth by trying to talk about this kind of stuff within this space where we don't have access, or we can't, Celia, like you said, we can't sit in on the kinds of conversations that these people had. But I think, sorry, I can make the slight case for that, but I think that redoing it this way was a much better outcome. I also wanted to quickly interject. Ben, who is one of our colleagues at Columbia Libraries, said that the Columbia URL is actually now live, so it's up and running. So this is the version here, rosehallproject.columbia.edu. So we'll once this is done, I can set up all the machinery to put all the machinery in place so that the previous URL, unsilencingslavery.org, still works, but it'll redirect automatically to the Columbia site. So that's pretty good news. I'm pretty excited about that. I reached a point yesterday or 2 days ago where I was like, I have other stuff I have to do. I can't keep checking up on this, but Ben apparently took care of everything in the background to get it up and running. So thank you very much for getting that done.
I don't know, guys. I kind of like on silencing slavery.
I know. I'm trying to figure out. So, we had to make a decision, at least with the book, because I wanted to include the website in the book, right? And the address.
The redirect can work the other way.
We can redirect the other way. Is that possible?
Yeah. So, of course, you can redirect any direction. So the thing is that,
Celia, haven't you learned yet that everything is possible?
Everything is possible
with this team.
I'm still struggling with that lesson, clearly.
So the book can stay as is. That we will have the redirect at Columbia.edu address, and then it will come here to. But I kind of like, because of the point you were making earlier, Moacir, like this is actually, like, the name makes a lot more sense when it's not Rose Hall. It makes a lot more sense when it's on silencing slavery, which goes to the heart of what we're doing here. Not about Rose Hall. It's about the people,
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of it not being either or, which is why I love the technology at work here, right? It can redirect, it can be both sides, not only, but also. Because, for searches, that was one of the things, right? It was like having Rose Hall in the title meant that if people were doing a search for it, anything regarding Rose Hall, it would hopefully also bubble up somewhere, maybe not to the top, but somewhere in there. Whereas with unsilencing slavery, you know, it might not in the same way. So I like the idea that we still can hold both of those, and that it's from Rose Hall to unsilencing slavery. So that all is
We
perfect.
can even
Well, there's
we can even add a little bit more because it's not only the title. So Google, for example, doesn't only index the titles of things. In fact, they care a lot more about what the content is, and if the content has variety, and if and actually they care even more whether people link to it or not. So they do an analysis of the content and they count the amount of people that link to it, and they say, well, this is what people are linking to when they're talking about X or Y. So but there are things we can do to help Google along. So we will actually we'll add some of that stuff. It's called, like, people call it search engine optimization. We will add some of that stuff to for Rose Hall, so that Rose Wholeness becomes like part of the honey that attracts those search results. Yeah.
well, it's also then this becomes utilizing redirects. What are they? 300 HTTP redirects. I think that's the code for redirect. Reutilizing those redirects in order to make an argument that you start with Rose Hall, and then through the technology of the internet, you end up at unsilencing slavery. So there's a maybe not quite a politics, but there's definitely an argument in how these URLs resolve themselves over space. So Ben made the announcement about the URL working in the chat, and I don't presume that the three of you are looking at the chat. So Ben also, Alex, can you talk a little bit more about the invocation of Du Bois? So Ben writes, back in the 90s, place was held up as a materialist repositioning of theory, but the tourist reception is a strong point. So that it's a parallel between Du Bois's visualization and technocratic rhetoric. So I'm trying to think of how the kind of sort of how I understand what Ben is talking about there is in terms of the how can we is it possible to, do we want to, what is afforded by trying to actually detach, when doing a materialist analysis of these 208 people, to detach the placeness in which they were situated. You know, like, because earlier when I was talking about this, I was being, you know, a little bit glib and saying, like, you know, that the Rose Hallness doesn't matter, but obviously it matters a little bit. But how, like, what does that push forward? And is it only mostly pushed forward because of this idea as a response and a retelling or a remembering, a retelling, or a telling the truths of what is now, you know, I don't want to say just, but the sense I get is just a tourist attraction. That's supposed to be but why
to expand.
Yeah, well, as we wait for Ben, like Celia, can
I was just going to say, well, first, thank you to Ben. I didn't say that. I meant to say that first. Thank you, Ben, for helping to get it live as well, the Columbia site. And you know, I'm thinking about a lot about data, and I mentioned this, I think, at some point in the book, but the ways that going to conferences, history conferences, and listening to a number of scholars talk about the data, right? And the importance of the data. And in some ways, discussions about the data, you know, how many people, what are the percentages, you know, even in terms of the transatlantic slave trade and dealing with numbers and percentages from where, from what communities to what communities and what geographical spaces, that all of that adds a lot of information about what we know and sometimes what we still don't know, right? And so the data is important. It's also, though, that sometimes when scholars are talking about the data and getting into either the economics of slavery or percentages related to the economics or the movement of people, that the people themselves become only data sets, and that the people themselves are a tool in order to get to a quote unquote more important story, right? About these percentages or the data that exists or doesn't exist. And so part of this for me is still recognizing the importance of data, but not necessarily utilizing it for a kind of re-objectification of the enslaved persons themselves, right? But trying to think about how do we integrate a narrative about these individuals that may not be entirely, again, definitively what we know moment by moment, or even year by year or lifetime by lifetime. But is there a way to tell it, to convey information that at least opens us up to the possibility of the stories that we don't know about them, rather than a focus on the limited data that we have, the limited information that we have about these individual people? Is there a way to open it up and say, yeah, there's a lot of limited information that we have, true. And one of the things I was thinking about the other day is how this focus on Annie Palmer and her life, right, and the mythical elements that have been created about her life that are the focus of the tour, that I'm thinking about in opposition to what we actually know definitively about these people from the archival records that we have. And we simply have more information about the enslaved persons at Rose Hall than we do about Annie Palmer. And yet the focus remains on her, right? So thinking about the meanings that we assign to data, not necessarily being positive or negative, but how we can use data in ways that are limiting and then also expansive. And so playing with that, no matter what the data is, or data are that we're looking at. So, but always this, you know, for many historians that and scholars who focus on slavery, we are always faced with that fact that we do not have the journals and the diaries of so many of these people because they were legally prohibited from reading and writing, even though many of them did, right? So to think about that, the structure of slavery that limited the literacy, right, of enslaved persons, and at the same time, how can we use the information that we have that is written about them, even if it's in the margins, to recreate and reconstruct some sense of some sense and sensibilities of their lives.
So there are.
I like the. Go ahead.
Well, I have a couple things. I just quickly want to sort of, because what you were just saying sort of ties a bunch of things together. So first off, can you, like for the record, tell us a little bit more about who Annie Palmer is and what her relationship is to Rose Hall?
All right. So Annie Palmer was a English / maybe English Scottish descent, of English and possibly Scottish descent, woman who lived in Jamaica, and her birth date is still somewhat in question, but certainly in the early 1800s, beginning in the early 1800s to about the 1840s. Right. So a lot, and she was a woman who was married to, that we know from the records, John Rose Palmer, who was British, who was the grandnephew, right, of John Palmer, who was the person who provided the capital to build the house that currently stands at Rose Hall today. So the property itself, called Rose Hall, had a number of different names in the late 1700s, right? And then once, you know, John Palmer comes into the picture and marries Rosa Palmer, that he is able to create and build this immense home There were smaller homes at Rose Hall at the time, right, in previous iterations of that. And anyhow, the story about her is such that she was married to the enslaver, the slave owner at the time, and the plantation owner, John Rose Palmer. He died several years before she did. He died in the 1820s. And so before the end of slavery in Jamaica, which happens in the abolition of the Slave Act is in 1833, and then between 1834 and 1838 is when slavery is essentially abolished in Jamaica on the ground. And so she marries John Rose Palmer and becomes the mistress of that plantation. And the stories that are told about her emerge from a novel that was written in the 1920s by a prominent journalist at the time in Jamaica. And his name is H.G. DeLisser, Herbert G. DeLisser. And he creates this story, this novel around Annie Palmer, and brings in fictitious elements. It is a novel after all, and brings in fictitious elements about her marrying several white men, British men, her killing those men, and her also being involved sexually and in other ways with enslaved men at that plantation. She herself, Annie Palmer, only married one man, John Rose Palmer. But Rosa Palmer, who was the previous mistress, actually was married to 4 men, the last of whom was John Palmer. And so part of what Herbert DeLisser does is combine those 2 stories. And as far as we know, Rosa Palmer did not kill any of her husbands. Combine those 2 stories and then create this myth about Annie Palmer being a witch and traveling to Haiti. None of that happened, but he creates this storyline about her being very involved in voodoo in Haiti. And then when she returns, though she doesn't go to Haiti, when she returns to Jamaica, becoming involved in the spiritual, religious belief system of Obia in Jamaica. And so a lot of the story in the tours is about the mythical pathways of Annie Palmer and her supposedly killing multiple husbands, and also being somebody who is involved in metaphysical work like voodoo and Obia. And that's what the story is. And at the end of the tour, you go to the outside and there is a coffin. And the tour ends with the tour guide saying, and this is where she was buried, but because she's a ghost, she leaves and comes as freely as we walk around today. And so that's where, and she's not buried there. But anyway, that's the storyline that's given. Sorry for the long thing.
No, that's great, because the reason I wanted to ask about it is because I was reminded when you were speaking previously about what I was trying to get at with the sort of distinction between the people and the place. And there's I'm thinking about this in terms of haunting, and in terms of the way that there is. Let's assume that Annie Palmer is a spirit that is haunting Rose Hall. Then that affixes her to, for eternity, because this is in direct contradiction with what you just said, because you said, she's, here's her coffin, but it's empty because she is free to move wherever she wants. So on the one hand, that's in contrast to the persons who are being remembered on the website who had no such freedom, and whose attempts to enjoy that kind of freedom ended up with their being, chastised in various ways, and up to the example of Archie, who ended up being transported for having run away so many times, if I recall correctly. So she's allowed to move freely. However, because she doesn't inhabit a material being or essence, she's somehow within the imagination of haunting. She's forced to haunt just this site. Like the way you go to feel the presence of Annie Palmer as the ghost is by going to the Great Hall. You can't, if you're sitting in Kingstown or something, or Kingston, you're not going to be, suddenly visited by her ghost. It's local to Rose Hall. Whereas even though we don't know, I think, much of anything at all about the people, about these 208 people outside of the information gathered within Rose Hall, we can imagine that they had lives outside of it. So there's this kind of unexpected, by rematerializing the discussion, and allowing these people to retake bodily form in some way. It also expresses how they move through space in trackable and in real ways that is befitting a human being, as opposed to sort of a spectral kind of that sense of haunting, and always of being only visible in a trace of some sort. So this is a really peculiar, I'm not just sort of speaking while thinking, but this is a set of really deeply enmeshed, contradictory sort of ways of thinking about this, because like the ghostliness of Annie Palmer really contributes to that. And I think that and that's also important. I also wrote down, because I wanted to think of this when you brought up the data. So for the viewers, the last couple of days have involved many emails about specific numbers, like specifically how many people were at Rose Hall in 1832 when certain things were drawn up. And the source of the tension is that so we'll start with the fact that the records themselves are can very easily be inconsistent, but then also some of the tension is like, Celia, you're like, no, I know there were only however many people, 111 or whatever it is, that like I have a list of them, whereas then I'm like, yeah, but the computer says, and because a lot of what I've tried to do is to take a data set put together by you based on materials that were collected perhaps by different hands over the course of 17 years. Wait, not 17 years, 14 years. No. Now my math is 15. There we go. Almost 15 years.
It's all right.
It's been a week. So I started with, it's been a day at the beginning of this, and now it's been a week, and by the end of it, we'll be like, it's been a quarantine. So over the course of the 15 years, it's possibly been in different hands, and so like different ways of recording these kinds of things have been in place. Like names are written differently. People are assigned different, I think, different racial designations, like different colors, but also I don't know if, there are some people who it's unclear if they're African or Creole, like whether they're born in Africa or born in on this side of the Atlantic. And so what I'm getting at is that, like, yes, data is tricky, but also that there's this tension that as we're working on this, there's this motion between trying to sort of come to terms with being able to say something concrete. So, for example, in my reflection is finally up. One of the reasons it took so long is because I wanted to say exactly, of the 208 people, that's not up for debate. There's 208 people. Of those 208 people, how many people were no longer at Rose Hall at the end of the record keeping that we have here? And I just couldn't get comfortable with an answer. I knew it's more than 90 and probably fewer than 100. But in between there, it's not quite clear, because you have people that are mentioned only once, and neither their passing nor anything comes up again. Like how is it the case that you have a clothing allowance in 1832 that presumably describes everyone there, but there are people not mentioned on that list who also have no record. There's no record kept of their leaving. And it's on the one hand, that sets up these kinds of gaps and these little fissures and these places, or these little these gaps where people can get lost in the story, get lost in the archive, and be like, oh, this is an interesting case. Why is it the case? Like, what happened to this person? Or to use that as a trigger to construct a story about them. You know, we know that they were there in 1822. They weren't there in 1832. What happened since? And out of that, do something like what was done with Annie Palmer, like create a complete narrative. On the other hand, there's also this kind of quantitative urge, from my perspective, as being someone who has to design these websites with that you know, like pixel by pixel, like if birth year this then this, like what do we do? You know, what do we do? Ben writes in that there's these kinds of normalizations around indeterminacy in country and racial designations. Yeah. So yeah, I mean it's the way that these things are being measured is tricky, it's inconsistent, and yet at the same time, like, but then this is maybe like, you know, I should save this for a therapy session, because it's kind of like, you know, why do I need to know, why do I have to narrow it down to specifically like 95 people were no longer there? It's terrible enough that almost half of this population went missing over the course of 14 years. What is added by like making the distinction between 94 and 95? On the other hand, that distinction is one whole person, you know?
Monique, how as you were doing these narratives, working with Celia on these narratives, and starting to see patterns emerge, how did you reconcile the sort of like the pool of the pattern and the importance of the percentage and the importance of the macroscopic against that other pool, the pool of the narrative of the person?
Yeah, I think the perspective or the mentality was different with the book versus the website for reasons we had said earlier, at least my understanding of it. Initially, I recall so many conversations in Professor Celia's office where I would like do a few pages of the archives and I'm coming back and I'm like, I found this in the margins, but then this person's name is no longer coming up, and or the numbers aren't aligned, like 1 year or one date says 100 and something, the next date says a different number. And I think I had to reconcile. I think Professor was a bit further on than I was. I think I had to reconcile that through conversation with Professor about one, I mean, the archives are, which is the foundation for where most of the information is coming from. They are, you know, humans make those, right? So there's going to be error, and then you're compounding that with the fact that these are worn documents that have been just preserved over how many years. I mean, some of the pages were water damaged, or so many different elements that go into how the data and information are compromised. And I think what Professor would always kind of like say to me and reiterate is like, we are the bigger purpose at hand is to recenter and recreate and reimagine the stories of the enslaved persons at Rose Hall. It's not necessarily to do each person to the same extent, because the truth is just that there's just different amounts of information about every single person that was there. And so also we're working with 208 people. Like, I think it became more, it was a reward when we found a lot of information on one person or two persons, or a female midwife like Dorinda, or as Moacir said earlier, Archie, or Arabella. These are people who would come up a lot. Their names would come up a lot in the archive documents. So I think it was more about pivoting to focusing, and Professor said this earlier too, in a way, right? Focusing on what we do have and what that opens up in terms of imagination, but also, what's the word? You know, taking advantage of Professor's vast knowledge of this topic in general. So when we had gaps on, I would be like, what are these duties? Like, what does that mean when they say this? Professor was able to provide like, okay, well, in this time during slavery, this is what that typically meant, or this is what a midwife's duties would typically be. And so we're able to piece together these larger, gaps. Some of the gaps we're able to piece together also using, the expertise of a historian. So I think with the website, that was the gaps became even more challenging because, as I said earlier, now we aren't really focusing on the larger story, which a book really does an amazing job at. We are looking at individual stories very explicitly and very discreetly. And I think that it also just became a matter of one, triple checking, double checking. So of course, always making sure that maybe the information is actually somewhere. So, not being too lazy about that. But then from my perspective, it was, we put in the profiles, you see that there are statements that are clearly just historically, these are supposed to be facts. This is when they said this person was born, this is when they died, perhaps the reason for their death, the kids that they have, etc. Sometimes there are moments where Professor and I would take that, continue on that thread in saying, this woman had X amount of children and this child died when they were 2 or they were 3 months. And can we imagine like what that effect, what that situation or that event would have on the mother? So those are things where I feel like there was, and that was done more so in the book, but also in the website profiles, where we try to give more color, it a bit more, right, with the humanity, with trying to give it a bit more flesh, where there were elements where there wasn't enough explicit information. And of course, there are certain people, and Moacir said this earlier, where they were mentioned once, and that was it. Like, they may have come up once in the journal, maybe it was a clothing allowance. And, we do our best to just, of course, deliver the facts that we know and also make the conjectures that are reasonably possible. But once again, you have 208 people and you just have kind of like varying amounts. I think taking the mentality that focusing on what we have and what we can extrapolate on kind of became the greater reward. And that also became that was a source of satisfaction for me, more so than focusing on the lack of, that's kind of a part of a lot of historical documents and events even currently happening in our political climate today. So yeah, I think that's how I approached it, specifically, especially under the guidance of Professor Celia. Yeah.
I wanted to ask.
Also, I was just going to follow up really quick that then, I kind of like it's funny because for me, that kind of like, it takes strength to not focus on the ones that have the least information. Like Jack, for example, is like you take it and you're like, oh man, it feels like those are like the ones that slip through your hands because you don't have anything to hold on to. They kind of stood out for me. But it's true though, what you're saying is it's good to at least try to not try to dwell on that, and then dwell on the abundance that we find in the rest. And in that abundance, I don't know what question Moacir wanted to answer, but at some point I wanted to talk about the flower, the patterns of the flowers. And what patterns kind of emerge that you don't see in the original sources, and that are not the narratives themselves, but like what do we see then kind of blooming out of the flower itself. For me, it was, just to give you an example, for me it was bonds that you can reconstruct around different criteria or different sort of vectors, right? So the bond of shared labor, the bond of age, being part of the same childhood, the bond of matrilineage, etc. That was something that comes out to me in all the different blooms of the flower. And that was something I wanted to ask you, but I don't want to set us off track too much. If Moacir, if your question had a little still more connected to this particular thread.
Before we go on to that, I just wanted to mention one other thing about the data and the information that we had, and to point out that we were looking at the slave registers, these triennial slave registers that were done every 3 years. And also, as mentioned, the Rose Hall Journal. which was a daily and weekly description and summation by the bookkeepers and sometimes the overseers from the same time period, 1817 to 1832. And one of the things, I mean, from the very beginning, it's clear that the math's not adding up, even when they're trying to add up, right? Because some of the white men who are taking notes and leaving those notes behind, that they are not necessarily mathematicians, or are they, and their math is not necessarily correct all the time. So to think about that, as they're doing their tallies, the tallies aren't correct. They're not adding things correctly. And what is striking, even as we think about the inconsistencies, and there are definitely some inconsistencies throughout, is how consistent some of the data is. And that is, I am actually surprised by how well we were able to track people, right? And I use the word track specifically here in terms of the registrars and the journal, so that with those triennial slave registers, there is an accounting of any children who were born and any individuals who passed. And that there is a significant, and I don't know the percentage, I'll have to look at that, but there is a significant correlation between the information that's provided in the slave registers and in the Rose Hall Journal, and that almost everyone actually is accounted for who is named. Lots of people who may not have been named at all, but for the people who are named, they tracked them fairly well. And that's even with, as you know, Monique mentioned, pages and pages, so weeks and weeks, right, of unreadable journal entries because of the age of these documents, as well as the, you know, the waterlogging effect of it, right? And so, you know, people, to the point Moacir mentioned even about freedom, you know, there's several of these individuals who left Rose Hall, who absconded, who ran away over 10 times, over 12 times, over 13 times, right? And their capacity, whether it was for a short term or longer term, their capacity to recognize and to tap into that freedom of mobility that was actually not legally granted to them. Again, in comparison to somebody like Annie Palmer, who, because of the racial and gender and class sensibilities of the time, was very much imprisoned at the Great House, unless they were traveling to England, right? So even thinking about the nuances of how we understand and how we utilize and chart what freedom means in spaces where we might imagine only bondage, and in spaces where we might imagine freedom as a result of being a free white person, the imprisoning effects of that time and geography as well. So anyway, just wanted to mention that in terms of data and the concept that Moacir mentioned about how we understand the limitations and again, the expansiveness of freedom.
Alex, do you want to reformalize, like re-ask your question?
What was yours though?
No, mine will come up again.
Okay.
I'll ask it a little bit later.
So I was thinking about the flower itself, which is the centerpiece, right? Which is in direct conversation with the narratives. Like literally, you click on a petal, a narrative comes up. You click on a narrative, a petal kind of emerges. But together, though, it makes a shape that changes depending on what view we have, and that actually puts petals in proximity to other petals for every different view. The petals that weren't together before become grouped together. And this is what I was saying about bonds. So you can see the bonds of labor closer together. As you start becoming familiar with with the 208 people, and then you start reading their stories and stuff like that, then you start seeing them rearrange themselves. According, like Dorinda becomes like one character in your story, and so does Jack, and Lewis and Daisy, etc. But then once you start they become part of you as you're doing this, you see them move forming these kind of bonds in the flower, right? And it's like, oh, look where Ruth falls here, you know. And this is something that for me was at least one of the most provoking and evoking things about the flower itself, how it actually, as opposed to like the normal way that people do this is through network graphs that show you the links between everybody. And it just becomes a constellation, but they're harder to read, I think, than this kind of just simply changing the view according to like, let's look at it through this lens, let's look at it through this lens. But it was a question to you. What patterns did you see? What about the flower? What does the flower evoke in you?
What knowledge does it generate, to use
Or
Johanna
what
Drucker's?
knowledge does it? Yeah, Johanna Drucker's thing. Yeah.
This isn't a question for me. This is to the other two, I suppose, if you want.
Yeah, this is a question to Celia and Monique, because me and Moacir were working on this flower for 2
Everybody.
years. Yeah, this is an open question.
Mr. Pickles can't answer though.
No, he just wants a snack.
I guess I'll start. I think Professor, when Professor first told me about the flower, and explained it, because it was basically, before I came onto the website, the flower was already formed, though it's gone through an evolution since. I thought it was a really great idea. I mean, of course, my first thought was, oh, this is like a more like an elevated pie chart, because there is still that element of sectioning and grouping, as you're saying, Alex. I think that, you know, and I know Professor is going to have more to say on this, but I mean, from what I know, even just in the start of the project, having a way, so we spoke about Rose Hall as the physical place, obviously, which there are pictures of. You can go there today or tomorrow, even if you want to, right? Just have to pay. But and of course, we have the names of these enslaved persons in the archival documents and in the book, but there is really no form of visual aid or visualization to any of these 208 people. So I thought, coming into the website, that the flower of Rose Hall was a really elegant way to just kind of bring some kind of visual aid to the amount of the enslaved persons that we have. Because in what you're saying, even Alex, the fact that the petals highlight, right? Because we had spoken earlier about like data, and sometimes a lot of these projects, or in regular history, a lot of these enslaved persons, just to speak frank, just become a number, right? It's just kind of like a statistic, it's a percentage. There's no real flesh behind that number. And I think that the flower does a great job of still sticking close to the facts and, you know, the percentages and the data, but offering a visualization that's a bit more stimulating than just having something to read necessarily, or just having a number to look at. And so, of course, you know, even if you go to like the nativity, and you'll see how it redistributes, you see a lot of the purples and pinks are in like one section, which are the African born, and those people just also happen to be older, of course. And then, you know, you go down to, and then of course the oranges and yellows are those who are Creole, which just means like they're born in Jamaica, even though we would assume that they're of African descent. So I think, yes, you have on one side, as I said, the visual aid, the elevation of taking something that is primarily just being written down, and offering some kind of stimulation in that way. And then, of course, from a data perspective, you also get the elevation of seeing, as you said, how these people regroup, who kind of comes next to the other. And lastly, I'll say, I personally love the matrilineage, formerly known as a family. I mean, even in the putting together of the archives, that was one of the kind of prioritizations, was tracking who was the child of whom, and maybe even making conjectures of who the possible fathers could be, as it's noted in the book and on the website. That wasn't something that was typically recorded, the paternal lineage. And so even seeing that visualized is just remarkable. Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned the pie chart, because a pie chart usually groups a bunch of people, but erases their individual,
individual.
erases them. The
Yes.
individual gets lost. Everybody becomes part of a color, but there is no more people in there. But this, yes, the shape of a pie chart, the color kind of rhetoric of a pie chart, but we don't lose the people. So that was important for us, not to ever lose the people at any like our response to that, our refusal of the pie chart is we will not erase the people. This is a pie chart being a visual standing for a percentage. We don't want to lose the people. Percentages make everybody one color, right?
Yeah, so it's kind of like the effort of, as we spoke about earlier, losing the people, how statistics data typically oftentimes does that, especially with these large numbers. Taking, the work with the book and going through each person, we have all this information. And that's what Professor would say in the beginning. We have all this information about all these names, and how is she going to do everyone justice? That's something that we talk about a lot. How do you do every story justice in a book that at the end of the day is still finite, and still has its own restrictions, as Professor had spoken about? And I think the website and then the visualization that you guys worked on, really you can see how that kind of like is a solution to these restrictive elements that we're constantly working around and circumventing.
I think there was a lot of time spent on that visualization. and I don't know, I mean, it's interesting to think about how much time and effort went into that. And that's not to say that, I mean, just the visualization by itself, in terms of it, just anyway, the different iterations of that. And I think one of the struggles too is and Monique, you mentioned this, sort of, we don't have the visuals of these people. We don't have any photographs, right? There may be photographs of some of these individuals, who are in like family collections of photographs, right? So not necessarily somebody who was born in the 1750s or 1760s, but maybe somebody who was born in the early 1800s, and I mean in the early so in the say 1850s, and then lived a long life, right, that we don't know about, right? We have maybe their birth, right, in the 1820s or even the early 1830s, and maybe they lived till 1900 and something, and there's an old, very old photograph of them in their old age, right? There may be some of those in family collections, possibly, but since we don't have those photographs, it's like, how do you represent the individual? And also this sense for me of not, and for all of us, not being just the individual, but part of a larger group, right, of people. We don't know really the individual interactions. We know that there were some individual interactions, right, whether along bloodlines or beyond the bloodlines. So the flower sort of opens us up to the flexibility and the fluidity of it, the nuances of those interactions that we can't necessarily nail down. And yet we know that interactions happen between these people, intimate interactions, and a range of interactions, a range of forms of interactions. And so at least there's there's like a subtlety of the flower that reflects some of that, right? The importance of the individual, as well as the importance of being on that plantation and not being alone at that plantation, and what that might have meant. So even that it's the curvature of it, right? I remember that meeting we had about the possibility of the curvature of it, rather than it being straight lines. I mean, just different elements that we've sort of lived through, that people may not necessarily, opening this up one time or multiple times, may not necessarily be attuned to or attentive to, and yet some of that may still be reflected and come across to viewers of it.
I just quickly want to add, one of this version this visualization, the matrilineage visualization, was kind of the last one we got up and running. And I think that I just wanted to echo what Monique was saying. Like, if you sort by age, you can see the age scale reproduced here in these circles, or in this circle, as people go from being born earlier in time to people born already during the point of time that's being recorded here. And one of the things that the way that color expresses itself in the matrilineage. So you brought up Dorinda earlier. I think this is, there we go. So if we zoom in on her, and then if we scroll down here a little bit, it should open up. Okay, Dorinda. So you see how many children she had, right? And they are represented in this picture by these subsequent petals. And so you see that the first group of children, they all, I don't know about they all, because there may be there's maybe a couple here, but many of them lived to 1832 or later. But then there's just this stream of lives cut short, and that gets reproduced several times throughout this. So in this, here, let me click here. So in this visualization, it's a little bit tricky to understand, which is part of the point. But basically, everything here and earlier, clockwise, is people about whom we know something about their matrilineage, about their families. These are going to be mostly men whose parents we don't know anything about, or even some women whose parents we don't know anything about, or who also didn't have children that we know about. And so it makes sense that these are all these deeper colors, because it's people who were older by the time they were at Rose Hall. So their parents weren't there, or if they were, they had already passed, and so on. But on this side, where you actually do see the parents, the levels of parenting, what really strikes me is that you have these enormous spaces of just these tiny yellow petals that are just like the same mother having just so this that's so oh, my this is there's a slight problem with doing things with the way the Columbia website is set up that we will take care of. So let me get to, and I'm not going to do it now because I promised I wouldn't make any changes to the website during the stream. So if I go back to Juno, who's here.
So just a little context for everybody. The stream has always been historically a place to do changes. This is why he's having a hard time, because this is how we coded the first year we started coding the flower. It was live, so most people saw on the stream was not intellectual debate, but for this kind of with a product, but actually intellectual debate around making. So it's like, right, it's before the storm, not after the storm. So.
Yeah, here I just have a checklist of things that I'm going to have to fix later. So things that I notice are broken. But what I want to point out here concretely is that, so in the case of Juno, for example, you just see that Juno had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children, and that there's this open space in the narrative which is telling the story of what it means to have that many children, but to have them all, or not all, but have many of them like perish shortly after birth. These are, if every dotted line separates 3 years, then you can see these are people, Cecilia, Lydia, Susan, people who babies who didn't make it to 3 years old. And I think that what I wanted to say in terms of knowledge generation is that sorting the things by this gives us these gaps. So here, this is the gap with Dorinda's later children. Her earlier children seem to have prospered. But it also then, what you can really see here, so this is Dorinda, right? Yeah. So I'm going to just click away, or I'm going to click away on someone else. And so this magenta stripe here is Dorinda. But we can see that the coloring, we can see the coloring changing, and we can see how little differentiation there is between the Dorinda color, which is around here, and then the colors of her children, to show that, you know, this woman was, you know, in her, she was 52 years old in 1832 and was 3 years removed from a pregnancy. So you see that through the way that these colors play out, you can see that the on the one hand, the closeness in age between mothers and their initial offspring, but then also how some of these mothers, as their colors got closer to purple, which means they were aging, they were still contributing to the community and still having, in the sense of having children who were part of the who made up part of the story here. So this was just an unexpected kind of thing that I only really started noticing when this particular visualization became available, which was very late in the game. So that's my bit of knowledge generation.
And there's also always the danger with all of the projects like this of the false knowledge generation. So remember that one thing when we saw that at one point we thought that most deaths were happening with I think it was with the African born or something like that. It was like until like Celia pointed out that that actually our data, it's just that we only have this data for 1832. I don't remember the details exactly, but there was a false conclusion that we were drawing, like, or I was drawing, like about 3 weeks ago, until we pointed out that it's just that we don't have this information. Yeah, there it is. It was by labor. Yes, so that I thought that all the people who worked on known labor were somehow dying more, but that was a false correlation because, and that's how we ended up with the tooltip, because it's just that our data just doesn't have labor information for before 1832. So that's why it seems like older generations were dying if we didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, we only have the duties were collected at one point in time, and as a result, it only covers about 111 people, and the rest of the people obviously had duties, but we don't know what they are, or in the sense that they weren't recorded in the same place that they were recorded in the for the rest of them. And yes, that doesn't mean that they were either didn't have duties or were working at something that was so horrific that it led to a nearly 100% fatality rate. It just means it's just a limitation of how of what was collected when. Celia, I think you wanted to add something.
No, I just think the sorting, I mean, and just looking at, you know, the way you went through the matrilineage of Dorinda and Juno and just in general as well, it's like there's just layers and layers of information, and you know, you can't necessarily access all of that if you're just reading through, like if you're just reading through the archival documents, you know, there has to be a way to organize it. And, you know, this was something Monique and I worked on for a while, because it was like, you know, it's 1,000 pages of the handwritten Rose Hall Journal. And so trying to extract as much information from the journal and then to organize it in a way, and the importance of structuring it, not necessarily of you know, reducing the complications of it, but just structuring the data in order to speculate with what we had, you know, and so the importance of the drudgery of that work, especially when it's handwritten. And like you said, Moacir, a number of different people. I would always be excited when it was somebody who had better penmanship, because it would take me less time to go through it, rather than to struggle over and over. And you just don't want to have, illegible throughout the book, right? Illegible, So there are very few parts of the book where that actually occurs, but the time that it takes to do that, to go through it, and then to come to that, to have this website where, Moacir and Alex have worked, like, just, I can't even, I would hate to actually add up the hours, and I hope you all didn't, because it would be insane, in terms of the calculations and the coding to try to present this, so that somebody could come to this website, not having looked at any of these documents, and come away with some sense of these people. That really was it for me. Just, the names, absolutely. And I didn't think I would even get as far as we did with the names, and then some additional information. And that's all, because again, due to forced illiteracy and the limited availability of reading and writing in general at this time, to still be able to present them like this. I mean, that's part of the reason why there's a myth, right? I mean, that's part of the reason why people make up stuff, because they're like, well, we don't have anything, right? And unfortunately, I don't have a journal or some reflections from Delisser about how he came to pull these things together in his own imagination, right? But he did. And so that's sort of, as a family friend, a daughter of a family friend said to me, she was like, this is the story we're told in school. What do you mean this is myth? This is it. This is the history. So, the importance of correcting that, right? That when school children of all ages go through Rose Hall, through that tour, and even with tourists too, so whether local to Jamaica or not, thinking that's the history, right? That's what they believe. And certainly there are references to enslaved children. There's a bucket that's brought out and said, enslaved children would carry this bucket. We don't know that that's the case, but they certainly carried buckets. And there's some references, but the overall story, the overall narrative is about how this white woman killed all these people, tortured, enslaved people, and continues to live on as a ghost, right? And so continues to live on in our imagination and in the stories and in the history, where her story, the myth about her becomes the history of slavery and Rose Hall, rather than these enslaved people, So that correction was really important to me. And going through the tours many, many, many times during many visits, and other people who are visiting and just being oh my gosh, this is such amazing history, and just being like, my God, I mean, like, and that they would take that with them, whether they're school children or not, would take that with them to say, oh, I learned so much about Rose Hall during this tour. And in fact, they learned very little. So that's really the reason for this.
I mean, that's
It made me think that we might want some later down the line, you should prepare like a 2 or 3 page teaching guide for high school. If this is how kids are going to get it, I would love to see this project and its richness be taught in high schools in Jamaica and in the United States too, in courses that deal with American history, because as a model, that would be great. But we need to always help the high school teachers to prepare, because they're overworked and underpaid. So like those teaching guides are a lifeline. Sorry, Moacir, I interrupted you. Go.
No, it was you tripped up a little bit my perfect segue, because the question that I had lingering that I wanted to ask of Celia and Mike, which was there was an urge, a desire to make this publicly available on August 6th, specifically August 6th, 2022. And I wanted to ask about the importance of that date and how the relationship of emancipendence, what the relationship is of emancipendence with precisely the role of Rose Hall in the story that Jamaica / Jamaicans / the state tells about itself themselves. And if you could help position that in some way, like, because I think that, just quickly, and then I'll definitely hand over the mic. Like, one of the things that when we were designing this, like Celia, you wanted to have Jamaican colorways involved in the design, like whether that be like Rastafari colors or the Jamaican flag or something, which I wasn't expecting. Like, it's great. Like, I'm not critical of it, but I just personally wasn't expecting it. I did not approach this thinking, yeah, there should be something about it that incorporates the Jamaican flag or something in those terms. But then once we started having these conversations about making it go live with Emancipendence, etc., it started resonating with this kind of with itself as a response to or as a critique of some kind of state building or nation building project. And that I want to know much more about, because I don't know anything about that at all.
And it's that is a whole nother lecture and many lectures. I will just say this, that how to make it not so special about Jamaicans and still special. I think it is important. Everybody's special. All the people, all persons are special. And there is something, I think, very tangible about many Jamaicans who are very proud about being Jamaicans, right? And the accomplishments of Jamaicans, whether they're at home in Jamaica or in the diaspora. So even something like, and just to be very specific here, so Emancipation Day, before Independence Day, right, in 1962, August 6, 1962, one of the moments that was celebrated in Jamaica and in other parts of the Caribbean, Anglophone Caribbean too, was Emancipation Day, August 1st, 1834. So the Abolition Act for the United Kingdom happens in August of 1833 to take effect, right, August 1st, 1834. So August 1st was something that many Jamaicans wanted to celebrate. And there was also resistance to that, to the celebration of Emancipation Day. That is a resistance to why bring up slavery again, right? That if you're going to celebrate Emancipation Day, in some way you're going to talk about slavery, right? Because that's in conversation with slavery. So over the decades, Emancipation Day was something that was celebrated. And then for a short time, it was not, especially with the advent of Independence Day from 1962 on. And then there were folks, scholars, people just in general who thought, no, we should actually celebrate both, right? Both Emancipation Day and still grapple with the afterlives of slavery as we talk about it now, and Independence Day, right? And so that was part of the reason for the emergence of Emancipendence, so that it would begin on August as celebration, a longer celebration, not just focused on 2 days, but actually a full week. And certainly informal and formal celebrations of Jamaican independence have been happening throughout the summer, right? In parts of England, parts of the United States, right? So it's not that people feel limited by that week, right? So Emancipendence, again, that combination beginning on August 1st, Emancipation Day, and then ending, right, on August 6th, Independence Day, is something that is celebrated not only in Jamaica, but throughout the diaspora. And I just want to make clear that Emancipation Day itself has been a struggle in terms of the celebration of that. And people have actually had to really strategize in order to continue those celebrations. And, you know, even over the last few years, there's been some resistance. Why are we still celebrating Emancipation Day? Let's just focus on Independence Day. And as you may have done the math, in this year, it's the 60th anniversary of Jamaican independence. And so even as I really wanted to think about how we honored that, right? Not just Independence Day or Emancipation Day, but more generally, people who, Jamaican, you know, individuals and families and groups who have pressed for freedom, right? So not emancipation as in the abolition of slavery, but a more expansive notion of what freedom really means, that is not just about a change legally from enslaved person to free person of color, right? So the expansiveness of freedom and the importance of that still lingers today, especially in terms of the social, political, economic, and cultural struggles that Jamaica as an independent country, and certainly many other Caribbean countries, face today as a result of American imperialism and other forms of imperialism too. So I wanted.
Oh yeah, don't forget the Canadians.
Yes, yes. So I wanted to at least there would be a nod to that, and for the colors of the Jamaican flag, yeah, in terms of the website itself, and I really appreciate Moacir like working with that. You know, I was like, okay, you know, like because there were initial colors, and I was like, well, you know, those colors aren't, can we incorporate the, you know, the colors of the Jamaican flag in some way, which many people identify, right? And can identify even if they're not Jamaican, just because they've seen that flag in so many different places. So yeah, a nod to something that is uniquely Jamaican in terms of that flag, while still telling a story that is not unique to enslaved persons in Jamaica, but experienced by many others throughout the diaspora.
Yeah, I would be remiss. We only have like 18 minutes left of the broadcast. If I didn't ask you to share a little bit of your experience of what it meant to us to work on this project together, because the thing is that, guys, remember, we did this during the height of the pandemic. And I know for me, seeing Moacir once a week on that show and working together at this helped us keep our friendship, you know, alive. Like it was like not, we didn't need it to keep our friendship alive. We had like, obviously you were going to be my friends. I have many friends that I don't even talk to. I see them 10 years later and we're still friends. I get that part. But what I'm saying is it was a great opportunity to, you know, break bread together, work together, and it felt like, you know, it felt a little less isolated to be there working on the project. At the same time that we were reconstructing a community that was also had pressures, that was being torn apart by the violence of slavery, we were ourselves experiencing pressures that were pulling us apart from each other, right? And there was death all around us. I lost some family members. I imagine you also may have lost friends and colleagues. And this project was, I think, the project I worked on the most during the pandemic. So I know this is a project I will never forget because of what it means, what it meant to us personally. But I wanted to know what it meant to you as we were doing this. I know you were deep in the documents, reconstructing these narratives while we were also trying to survive this pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I was focused on, and I want Moacir also to talk about sort of that. And since it just went up, I haven't read Moacir's reflection, and that's the first thing I'm going to do when I get off. But I think it was, I think there was something about, and other people have talked about this too, right? Working on something like this during the pandemic, when a sense of community and connection seems so fraught and in sometimes potentially fatal. And so to the extent to which, you know, Alex, you mentioned sort of the bonds, right? And a recognition of, the bonds that, again, a nod in some ways to the ways that people create bonds that, yes, can certainly be experienced with physical contact, but that physical contact is not actually a necessary requirement to feel a connection to someone, whether or not that person, as some of us often say, has dropped the body or not, right? Whether that person is still here in physical form or not. And so it's, I think, a testament in terms of what you both were able to do with this as a way to, express and to use this website, this project, as a way to connect. And as you said, Alex, there would have been other connections, but it allowed you to focus in on a specific project, and at the same time to talk about other things as well as you were doing that, right? That it wasn't only, not every minute of that's recorded on YouTube is only about Rose Hall, right? There's levity, right, in it. There's joking about different things, right? There's a light-heartedness to that is involved. That's part of the reason, I think, that when you open up the website and you see the flower, as we're calling it, of Rose Hall, that the first image is not one where you feel a sense of pain, or that image is not necessarily one where you might feel torture, right? But there is an aesthetic beauty that Moacir was able to create in terms of and Alex were able to create in terms of the manipulations of various codes and mathematical equations and all of that, so that when you open it up, it isn't, you don't feel a sense of drudgery or pain. I mean, certainly when you read those stories and those profiles, that when you start putting things together, you recognize that many of those profiles are deeply embedded in pain and torture, right? And some of the experiences that people had. But in opening up the website, it's not as if you open up to images of whippings, right? That's not the first image. So I think that's also important. Like, how do we enter into various ways of studying slavery that allows us to grapple with the pain and the torture that was endemic and certainly major tenets of the institution itself, and still to enter in where we can imagine and also even present some sense of levity and even love and joy in terms of some of the profiles of these individuals that we don't have definitive stories or biographies for, but what we do have very much is about bonds too, and so that you were able to work on a project during that time. I mean, and yes, I know we're still in the pandemic, right? But that you were able to work in those particular phases or stages of the pandemic, and to experience, yes, it was a labor and work, but also it brought you together in different ways that maybe you might not even have been brought together if we had been in person on that regular basis, right? You never know.
I come from a people that celebrate funerals by making jokes by laughing and crying, but laughing. And that's a juxtaposition of death with levity for always. To me, it always meant life. Life means coming together in the totality of all the things: the anger, the pain, but also the laughter and the love. And I think I see this here as a very good antidote to the scenes of subjection of what we can call violence, like the scenes of subjections that's ideas that everybody seems to be obsessed with, that like just like this, just focusing on the thing. And I'm talking about scholarship in particular, how scholarship wants you to see this, right, all the time. And I think we did good here in showing like that life, even in death, that life never works like that. Life never is just pure pain, pure violence. Even as we insist on reparations, and because I know that why a lot of people do it, they're like, look at the crime. Like we need justice, right? But at the same time, it's not only our job to adjudicate the crime. We owe something else to the people that lived here and toiled there. I think a recognition of the fact that they were alive, and that that many of them probably experienced joy and laughter and all these things.
Yeah,
Just a quick thing, just to say that is part of the reason why so many survived, right? Is that it might be hard, and I do think, even when I teach certain parts of slavery, right, that it is important to, on the one hand, keep the violences of slavery in your mind, in your consciousness, and at the same time to leave some space, right? The absolute necessity of leaving space for love and joy that people experience, even in the midst of all of that, and not to have it be 100% only focused on the violences that are well documented, right? Just in terms of the funeral thing, a friend of mine who's African American, that we often joke, that with certain funerals, that they should become funerals, right? That there should be fun in the funeral, not just the mourning and the sadness. So anyway.
I just wanted to kind of build on this sense of community building, and redirect the question about Jamaica to Monique too, because I want to hear more about it. Which is that the one, because I'm trying to now imagine this so I really like that idea of wanting to include the colors, etc., because there's a desire to have there's a connection to something resembling like national pride, national pride, state pride. Like, these are complicated terms, but this is how I'm hearing this resonate a little bit. And then what then follows from that is the way that this counter history, as it were, in the sense that it's not what school children are learning, because it's not what happens at the tour, how this counter history helps establish a counter, maybe not quite counter, but a different branch of something resembling national pride, and a different kind of way of imagining Jamaicanness through how the people persisted inside what we know about this group of 208 people over the course of these 15 years. That there's I'm speculating again. Is it the case that this can help retell the story about what it is for Jamaica to exist, and what it is for Jamaicans to exist as a coherent group of people that is not just geographically collocated or a diaspora based on some kind of geographical collocation, but also that comes out of these kinds of experiences in some way, and that also helps explain this desire to relate these stories, because yes, emancipation happened right after the data collected here, but these stories aren't explicitly about independence. They're not explicitly about establishing a sense of one's position within a post-coloniality. I'm very struck by the idea of that Annie Palmer's story gets retold in histories to this day, because it would seem like something that would precisely be something that has been moved past. So if it is getting retold, what is that retelling? What are those stories doing to inform this sense of, again, Jamaicanness that this is a challenge to? Now I'll stop. I hope that's a straight question.
That's a wonderful question. And you and everybody, all the collaborators here always ask these amazing questions. You know, even though the records end in terms of 1832 for Rose Hall in this particular way, and certainly with the Abolition Act in 1833, right, that slavery itself as an institution, certainly neo-slavery continues in different ways, but slavery as an institution ends in Jamaica. That, and certainly that's way before anything called Independence Day, right, in 1962, and the lead up to that over generations, that it is all connected, though. That is the sort of the objective, the goal, the purpose of freedom. Again, an expansive notion of freedom, and that independence, right, is tied to an emancipation of sorts, right? That is often seen as political or economic, but is also cultural, is social, is intellectual, is many things. And so I see the two, part of the reason that I actually like the term that is utilized today of emancipendence is to actually see the connections between these things. And we're talking about freedom fighters over generations, beginning with the first people who are enslaved, right, in a place that becomes known as Jamaica, who are actually not of African descent, but are indigenous people, right? And how that then expands to include people who are of African descent, some of whom are also of indigenous descent, indigenous native descent, right? We can talk about indigenous people of Africa as well, right, who are transplanted there. So there are different indigenous peoples who are experiencing bondage and also being very aware of what freedom means and looking to that, right, as a process and achieving that, no matter whether it might be for some enslaved persons who run away for a day or a couple of days, or even in 1832 in that last clothing allowance list where they're marked as and listed as runaway, right? And may have self-emancipated before even the Abolition Act is passed, right? So I think that, again, independence, emancipation, that is still part of a story of freedom and Jamaican freedom. Yeah. And people of African descent everywhere, right? And freedom generally too.
I think Monique should have the last word.
Yes, please.
I don't know
Monique,
if I need the last word. No.
please.
I was just going to add to say that, you know, to just add to Professor Celia's point, like, I think with this project, a lot of it, well, I want to say like Rose Hall Great House is not just a great house as a tourist destination. It's a huge like attraction of Jamaica that's been around for decades. So that's why people like me as well grew up in Jamaica. I also thought Annie Palmer was like factual history. I grew up understanding this story. Everyone just kind of knows about it, even if you've never been physically to Rose Hall. So Rose Hall is something people already associate with Jamaica, even though, as you're saying, Moacir, and as we also understand, that's not necessarily something emblematic of being Jamaican or Jamaica. And to just Professor Celia's point about emancipation and independence being linked, I mean, I think a lot of what this is about is just truth, right? And like, so we're going through the archives, Professor's doing the book, this team is doing the website, and all of this is a way to make the truth of these stories and these people and of the estate, which is what, which is where they live, more accessible, one, apparent, and then also with the digitization, more accessible, which was really important to Professor Celia. Initially with the book, she was like, I want a website. I don't know how it's going to happen, but it can't be just that someone has to read a book to figure this out or to have this information at hand. And so I think that, there's so many powers at play. And I think that a huge part and element of emancipation and independence is truth. And it's a freedom to also exercise the ability to speak that factual, since we are talking about history and we're talking about factual documents, to speak that truth, even if it's against something that has been ingrained as the historical truth of Annie Palm and all these, stories, that, I've been, as I said, I grew up also thinking that as well. And I think it's a really powerful thing. I think the fact of, as we talk about this website, became even more powerful to see that the digitization and having this website actually did come into fruition. And so that actually just makes it all the more accessible, and actually just makes the purpose of the project all the more realized. So that's my 2 cents on that part. I don't need the last word, guys.
That was a brilliant last word. Thank you, Monique,
That was
for the last word.
perfect.
That was perfect. Guys, we did it. This is great. Everybody, I hope you have a fantastic week. And please, take a moment to rejoice that we did all this work, and it is gorgeous. We will worry about the small mistakes later, and we'll figure it out. But for now, this is outstanding. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Moacir. Moacir, by the way, the mathematical equations and all that stuff, this is mostly Moacir. I was just asking questions, try to make the questions the right ones while he remembered college trigonometry. Thank you.
Not even college trig, much earlier trig.
So, Moacir, it's your show.
Sure. So, thanks everyone who tuned in, and everyone who is tuning in from the future. The best URL, on August 9th, 2022, the best URL is unsilencing-slavery.org. We will, as that changes, it will change, but you will hopefully always be able to get to this project through there, whether that's the final URL or not. And I'd like to, when we started the stream in the fall of 2020, we talked about how we wanted to have Celia come on the stream once. Monique, this was, if you were helping on the project already in ways that were invisible to Alex and me, so we didn't even have that available as an option. But I'm beyond thrilled that this happened, and that the little technical hiccups and everything got straightened out, and we had what I hope was a engaging and productive conversation about this project and about the sorts of questions that it brings up for people for the future. Because I think that's always what's important here, is how does this reflect on to what future scholars, but also future people trying to understand their relationship with their with where they live, or the kinds of histories in which they've been reared, how they understand their relationships with that. So again, unsilencing-slavery.org. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Thank you to the 3 of you for putting up with this. I hope none of you is currently as hot as I am, because I had to turn my fan off so that it wouldn't be whooshing through the microphone. And I'll be back next week here on YouTube to work on WanderText, different projects. So let me switch back to seeing all of your faces in larger format, and you can all say goodbye, and then that's that. So
Thank
bye-bye.
you all. Thank you, Moacir, for this. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.